Most automotive locks today are wafer-style locks. Therefore, it's critical that we understand how the wafer lock works. So before we start looking at automotive locks, I want to take some time and just study a small wafer lock and make a key for it. I would suggest that you watch this part of the video before attempting to do the actual exercise of making a key. Once you've finished watching this section, I do think it's very important for people who have never done this before to actually get a wafer lock and make a key for it. Now, the fastest way to get a wafer lock is simply go to the hardware store and buy one. Just ask the clerk for a wafer lock or a cam lock like the one you saw in the video. That will allow you to get going right away with this activity. While you are at the store, get a couple of uncut key blanks for the lock. Now, if you're an experienced locksmith and you've already worked with impressioning keys, there's probably no reason for you to complete this exercise. Now, if you are totally new to automotive locksmithing, I have a suggestion that you may want to try and do an activity with a cam lock to just become familiar with cam locks and how they work and the structure and functions and so on. So I'd suggest going to the hardware store and just buying a cheap $5, $6 cam lock. And let's take it apart and look at it and also see if we can make a key for this lock. And so while you're at the hardware store, go ahead and ask for a key blank. Tell them you want just a straight key blank, uncut, that will fit this lock, and they'll normally sell you one. We need to take the screw off the back. There'll be a big nut on there. Take that off. Get that out of the way. Okay, so we take the plug out of the shell. We can see that there are 5 wafers from the front of the lock, counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you can see that they are sticking up because there's a spring under each one. You can see where the little holes are. That's where the springs go in first, and then the wafers go down on top of those. And they have a little shoulder that holds them in there. We can push them out from the bottom. Now you can see that as I turn it, how they stick up on the top. The wafers stick up. They're obviously not going to allow the lock to turn. You can see these wafer chambers that when the chambers are up in there, that's not going to be allowed to turn when they're up in those chambers. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and push one of these wafers out of here. Okay, so the spring would ride underneath this little shoulder and push the wafer up into this chamber, and it would be locked. And then when you put the key in, the wafers will be flush with the shear line and the plug can turn in the shell. So the key will push down on this part of the wafer here and bring it down. If the key's cut correctly, bring it down to the correct depth to get it to the shear line. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and put this wafer back in the lock, and we're going to get on with the exercise that I wanted to show you. When it goes in, you'll feel it catch in there. This lock can be locked in 2 different positions. What the key does, we can see if put that in there just part way. Then take the key, and you can see that the key will pull those down to where now they're down inside the plug. It's going to turn because they're out of those wafer chambers. So they're not blocking the plug from turning. what I'd like you to do, we have the idea that, again, that you put the key in, pulls the wafers down flush, the lock turns. But what if we have no key? Okay, so now we need to make a key so that it will do that. And this is basically what you're doing when you get called out to make a car key, because probably 99% of all of the locks that are on cars in operation today are wafer locks. And it doesn't matter if they're split wafers or if it's a sidewinder key or what it is, it's still, the basic design is still just a simple wafer lock. What I'd like you to do is put your key blank into the lock. You can use a Sharpie for this, or you can use a scratch awl. That will work also. We're going to just need something that will put a mark on the key blank right next to each of the wafers. Just a dot is fine. Just put a dot on there as close to the wafer as you can. Just like that. Take it out and hopefully you're going to be able to see your 5 marks. Our 5 marks, they are there, 1, 2, 3, 4, and the last one's right on the very tip. Okay, then put your lock aside for a minute. Get a file, a round file, and now I put the marks going towards the tip. So the wafer is really on this side here. It's on this side of the mark. So I want to make a small mark, a file mark right on this side of the black mark that I made. And do that to all 5 of those. You know, not too deep, but deep enough that you can definitely see where it's supposed to be at. So if you look there, now I have 5 little file marks on my key blank. Okay, now let's take the key blank, put it back in the lock, and let's study the wafers here. We can see that already in the number 1 and number 4 wafers, that those wafers are already even with the plug, or even with the top of the plug, and they're even with the shear line. You can see they're even on both sides. So 2, 3, and 5 are not. So we need to file 2, 3, and 5 a little bit so as they will not, the key blank does not pull them so far out of the plug. We can see that 2 only needs a little filing, and then 3 and 5 need more than number 2 does. So let's just do that. Okay, this is number 2. And then number 3 and 5, we said were deeper. Okay, now I'm going to primarily focus on number 2, but I'm going to do all of those 2, 3, and 5 a little bit just to get them going. Now, if you're already fairly experienced as a locksmith, this activity probably is a waste of your time. But for a new person that's just getting into locksmithing, I really think this is a valuable exercise, especially if you're trying to break into automotive locksmithing. So let's take a look and see now. Okay, the 2 is much closer, but it's not quite flush. It actually probably would work. 3 and 5 have a little ways to go. We're going to give number 2, just take a little deeper on number 2. Just to make my point here. I don't want to waste a lot of film on this, but I do think this is, again, an important activity for people that are brand new to this. So you can see that now that number 2 is pretty flush here. It's not quite down far enough. It needs a few more file strokes there. And then 3 and 5 need to go quite a bit deeper. Now I'm not going to waste a lot of film time on doing this, so I'm going to file this off camera and then I'm going to show it to you. Okay, I'm back with the key that I was filing, and we can see that if we try this in the plug, it pulls all of the wafers down flush. So it took about 7 or 8 minutes, I would say, to file that down. And you do just like I was showing. You just file a little bit, put it in, and see if it's right. If it's not, you file a little more until you get it correct. And now let's compare that with the key. This was the original working key that came with the lock, and you can see that the key that we made is nearly identical. Now there is a faster way to make that key. I could just take it, read the wafers, put my blank in here, and read the wafers, how high each wafer is, and go to a code machine and cut the key on the code machine. And that's what we're going to be doing to make car keys. We're not normally going to be filing by hand, but occasionally, as you know, if you took the impressioning course, that to impression the lock, we're going to need to file it by hand. And that often comes into play in automotive work that will be off a little bit on one cut, and we are going to have to hand file to get the key to work exactly right and to establish the correct cut of the wafer. So we'll see all of that later in the course. Okay, so here using the key that I filed by hand, I have the lock assembled just to show that the key will work the lock once it's assembled, and you can see that it works very smoothly. So that if you have the lock plug out like this, or even if it's not out of the shell, but you can see the wafers, and you put in an uncut key blank and look at how far it pulls the wafers past the shear line, you can actually read this once you've had a little bit of experience, and it doesn't take long to get pretty good at this. But number 1 cut is a 1 cut. We don't need to do anything to that spot. And also on number 4. And then here's a 2 cut, and then here's a 3 cut, and then here's a 3 cut. So to read this, we have 1, 2, 3, 1, 3. And we can, again, take that to a code machine, any kind of code cutter, cut the key to that combination, and the key will work the lock. Okay, now I've taken the wafers out of our cam lock, and they're arranged in order, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And I'd like to show the differences here at the bottom. Notice how much wider this wafer is at the bottom than right here. And this is the part that the key presses down on. So we had 1, 2, 3, 1, 3. Notice that both of these are 1s. Notice how narrow this bottom component is. The 2 is a little bit wider and therefore requires a deeper cut to get this to come down to the same level as this one. The 3 wafer has even more room here, so it's thicker, so we're going to have to cut the key deeper. Otherwise, it's going to push it down below the 1s and the 2s, isn't it? So we have to adjust the depth of the cut on the key depending on which wafer is in there, and this is the difference in the wafers is this part down here. So that's what is going on with this with the wafers as the key goes into the lock, slides over this bottom part, and if it's the right cut, it will line them all up evenly at the shear lines. I have a drawing here of a wafer lock like the one we just made the key for. Shows a wafer being pushed up by a spring into the wafer chamber to lock the plug so the lock will not turn. It cannot be opened as long as the wafer is in that position. The key would come in here pushing down on the wafer, and it would free it from this chamber and allow the plug to turn. Another option is to have opposing wafers, so that instead of only one wafer going up, we have a second wafer being pushed down. In this case, there would be 2 locking chambers for the wafers to go into. This would require a double-bitted key, so that when the key went in, it would push the one wafer down to free it here, and it would push the other wafer up to free that wafer from this chamber. So that would be another example of a wafer lock, and these wafers are referred to as opposing wafers. Okay, another type of wafer lock is what's called a sidebar lock, and it works differently than the other wafer lock that we were looking at and made the key for. The way this works, there's what's called a sidebar that goes out into a sidebar chamber and prevents the plug from turning. The wafers have a notch in them that if the notch lines up with the sidebar, it allows the sidebar to move in or recess into the plug to free it from the shell, and it can turn. So we would have springs on both the sidebar and we would have springs on the wafers. In this example, I have the spring here pushing this wafer up. The key would have to come in down here and pull the wafer down until this notch lined up with the edge of the sidebar. There will be small springs on the sidebar that will push it into that notch and allow the lock to turn. Here's a drawing that shows what the lock would look like in the open position. I didn't draw the key in here, but the key would be inside the lock, again pulling the wafer down, and then the springs would push the sidebar into the notch, and there would be a little gap created here where the sidebar is free of the shell and allow the plug to turn. Here's examples of the different wafers. This is just a standard wafer. Again, there would be a spring that would be putting pressure against his shoulder, pushing this up. Notice there's no sidebar notch on this wafer. This is a sidebar wafer. Notice this little V notch right here in the side. That's where the sidebar would have to slide into when it was lined up appropriately. And then here's another type of sidebar wafer, and the notch is right in here. Here's an example of a sidebar, and sidebar has a V edge. It's going to be hard to see on the video because of the shape of the sidebar, but it has a V edge on one side that would go right into the slot like that. And it doesn't move much. It's a very small movement. It is always needed to free the plug so it can turn. Okay, I want to show you another wafer here. And you can see that this wafer looks very similar to the other wafers that we looked at. It has a shoulder here that a spring can fit under to push this wafer either up or down, depending on how it's put into the lock. I'm going to move the spring out of the way for just a minute now. Notice here that there's a cutout here. And this is the main difference in this wafer as compared to the other ones. It's a little smaller here and probably a little bit wider up here. This wafer is out of a high security lock, and it operates the same way as the wafers that we just got through looking at in the little wafer cam lock that we made the key for. The spring pushes it up, the key pushes down against the spring, or vice versa depending on the orientation of the wafer. But this little cut here is where the key rides at, right on this little notch right here. And so these are the keys that you call the laser cut keys, or the side winders, or the side milled keys that you hear people talking about. This would be an example of the type of wafers that are in those locks, and there's very little difference between these and the very first wafers that we looked at. It's just a matter of how the key contacts the wafer. That's the main difference. Now, as we go through this course talking about these locks, I'm going to refer to this piece that the key goes into, the piece with the keyway that turns. I'm going to refer to that as the plug. And whatever the plug goes into, I'm going to call that the shell. So this would be the plug, this would be the shell. Now, if this component goes into something else, then I would call that a housing. But there is a little difference of opinion on the technical use of these terms, and I just want to keep it as simple as I can. I think that if I call this a plug and this a shell, and then whatever this goes into a housing, it's very similar to the terms that you learned in residential and commercial locksmithing. I may not be technically correct in the use of these terms in every single case, but I think if we just have an understanding that's what I'm doing, I think it will make it simpler for you to follow along in the discussion. So for another example, I would call this piece here the plug. It has the keyway in it, and I would call this piece the shell. One other example here. Again, this would be the plug, and this would be the shell. Please take just a moment to like the video and also subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.